everyone, and welcome to Writing for Roleplay, a tabletop RPG podcast. I'm Kevin.
And I'm Kayla.
And today we are delving into the shadows, audience. For today we are talking about tackling dark themes in your roleplay. Now, storytelling explores the human condition, and that is also true for collaborative storytelling. And I'm of the firm belief that there are no themes that are off limits, except for the ones that are ruled off limits by your table. Now, if you're doing an actual play, there are other considerations you have to figure out, of course, your distribution platform, your audience, etc., etc. But we're going to be focusing mostly today on tackling dark themes at your table with your friends or with new people you're meeting at a convention or at a game shop, whatever. Kayla, do you have any thoughts so far before we delve into the meat of this?
It's interesting because I am a huge, horror fan. So there really is not a lot of things that I would consider to be off limits in terms of what I am willing to undergo, I suppose, for the sake of the story. However, I acknowledge that everybody's built different, basically, and that's fine.
Oh yeah.
And it would be cruel to make somebody go through a very dark horror campaign if that is not something that they are into at all. And when you bring into, and we've touched a little bit upon this way back when at the beginning of this podcast, when we talked about problematic elements in genre as old holdovers from ye olden days. And this is kind of where the metal hits where the rubber hits the road.
There we go.
In terms of, are you going to have the elements of bigotry in your game? And is that something that players are cool with? Because some people are going to, some people are like, yeah, actually, I would like this character to be incredibly sexist to my character so that I can have the wish fulfillment of kicking his ass.
Yeah. And
showing him what for. And other people are going to be like, I get catcalled enough. Let's not bring that into the fantasy game.
I think a big thing that we covered in those earlier episodes was it's not about avoiding all problematic elements. It's about paying attention to the problematic elements that you're putting in. And that's the whole thesis of this episode.
Yeah.
Because, like I said, storytelling explores the human condition. And it's not a bad thing to have, in your character backstory, I was from an orphanage and the matron, the person who looks over the orphans, I can't remember that job title, the orphan keeper.
Orphan manager?
Yeah, the orphan manager was straight up like the woman from Annie, and she sucked, and I was traumatized by it. Or you're playing a dark noir game, and it's I'm a detective, and I've seen some of the worst stuff on the streets. I've seen things you wouldn't even imagine. And it's a lot of times it's very fun to tackle those themes, especially if that's the kind of game that you're going into. But that's the important bit, is that you should know the kind of game that you're going into. And also, the person presenting that game, whether you're the GM or the host of an actual play, should make it clear that that's the kind of game you're going into. And with all other media, with, TV, you have content warnings. With movies, you have, the rating system. With video games, you have the ESRB, where it's the little square on the cover. And it's hey, just a heads up, this is rated M, and it has all of these things in it.
Yeah, even books are starting to get, books are kind of the last bastion sort of unrated content, in the sense that, when it comes to video games, movies, even music has to have the explicit sticker on it. Movies self-censored to avoid government censorship in the post-Hays Code world. And video games, I think, is probably a very similar thing. Manga has ratings, and so do comic books, but books do not. The biggest thing you get with books, and I don't necessarily believe that books should have ratings, in the sense that I don't necessarily want to, a 13-year-old or a 14-year-old can't go see a rated R movie by themselves without sneaking into it. Mm-hmm. However, a 14-year-old absolutely can get Stephen King off the shelf and read it. Nobody's going to card them. So I think if we put in explicit ratings, or just a general ETME sort of rating system within books, the way that AO3 does for fan fiction or whatever, I don't necessarily think that would be a good thing, because I don't want to start carding kids for getting, horror books, or even like teenagers picking up smutty romance novels. So I don't want anything like that to come into books. However, that being said, like I said, I read a lot of like dark fantasy or horror, and content warnings have become more and more popular in books, and that I think is a great idea. If you're uninterested in content warnings, if you don't have triggers or issues with anything like that, you can easily skip over, and you feel like content warnings are spoilery, you could very easily skip that page. I think anybody should be able to pick a book off the shelf, see the content warnings, if there are any that are applicable, and then immediately go into it without having to do too much prior research.
So transferring that line of thought to tabletop role-playing games, which is the thing we're talking about. I agree with your points on books. I think having like a little like, hey, here's a list of fucked up stuff that's in this book is great. And I think that when you're running a game, and this is something that I do all the time, especially if I'm running a new campaign, especially if I'm running a horror campaign, which you and I both love.
Yeah.
I like to have, you know, like a little one page that explains the world that I write up. And I also very much love to have a session 0, especially if I'm doing like a, you know, like a campaign with a group that I'm not used to, or, you know, it's a new like group of people. During session 0, I love being like, hey, here's what this adventure is like. Here's going to be some of like the big beats. Here's going to be some big things that are going to pop up here. And like, here's going to be like the tone. And I think that was very useful. Like the 3 like big D&D 5e modules that you and I have run together in a group, Out of the Abyss, Descend to Avernus, and especially Curse of Strahd. Don't talk enough about Curse of Strahd on this podcast.
Take a shot every time we talk about Curse of Strahd.
God. Or go to our Ko-fi and you can check out our bonus episode on Curse of Strahd. Plug.
Ayo.
But no, it's like, you know, we start Out of the Abyss. We were a brand new group, and I'm just like, hey, listen, the beginning of this adventure, you guys are slave prisoners to the Drow in an underground world, and it only gets weirder from there.
Yeah.
And, you know, just having that, like, getting together and talking about stuff is another reason why session 0, not only for creating your characters and getting the vibe of the group, but also getting a vibe of what you're getting into, is very, very important.
It's also good, not even, like, and to talk about tone further, you know, a lot of the difference between, to bring it back to fan fiction ratings, there's a question of, like, well, what's the difference between rated mature and rated explicit? And it's kind of like, well, what's the difference between rated R and rated NC-17? And at the end of the day, the difference is the details. How detailed are you getting? If you're a little more vague, it's mature. If you're explicitly detailed, if you're being explicit, that's explicit. Like, that's what it means. You're very detailed. And so that comes through in descriptions of, for example, violence in battle and stuff. Like, is the DM talking about how this necromancer is like rendering ribs from your chest in order to like raise another zombie or something like that, in graphic and grotesque detail with sound effects? That might be a bit intense for some people. They may not want that. You can just say, you know, you can be more vague. They're like, I'm okay with body horror. I just don't need you to describe exactly how the ribs are cracking. You know, just say like, they ripped the ribs out. And it's like, that's fine. You know, you don't need to like add squelching noises, man. It's like, I like the squelching noises, but that's okay. You know, I read Goosebumps at an incredibly impressionable age and it changed me, but not everybody did.
And it's very important to acknowledge different experiences as well, because there are, like, people come in different flavors, and their fears and their squicks and their traumas also come in different flavors as well.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, there's, you know, like, there are broad, like, themes that, you know, almost everyone in society is like, that's bad. But there are also, like, some people who have, like, very specific experiences where it's stuff like clowns or spiders or religion can be dark themes. And, you know, like, going on those experiences and communicating with those people is important to the enjoyment of the game. And if you don't mind, I'm going to launch into a personal story here real quick.
Have at it.
Yeah, and this was a story of me messing up. And, you know, I've talked to this person who, you know, this happened with, and they were okay with me sharing this on the podcast. I won't share their name.
Oh, I think I know what story this is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was playing a game with a good friend of mine, and at one point in the game, their character went off alone to try to fight the big bad guy by themselves. Always a bad idea. And it ended up with them basically being thrown into a fiery pit. And me in DM mode, I'm like, okay, this is his character's death. I need to be dramatic. And I started like describing like, oh, you fall into the fire and all this stuff happens to your flesh and bones and you scream and da-da-da-da-da, all this stuff. And then after the session, that player, came up to me and was just like, hey, so great session, had a lot of fun. Listen, next time something like that happens, can you move away from like the descriptions of fire? I was in a house fire when I was a kid and my arm is still burnt up to this day. Like that is a very like traumatic experience for me. And I'm like, oh, I messed up. I apologize. And they're like, it's cool. And like that's the thing. It's like I know we're talking a lot about like, hey, think about what you're doing and be sensitive to others' experience and all that. But it's also okay to mess up. You don't need to take like 5 cultural sensitivity courses before you play a tabletop game with your friends.
If you're playing a game, like, I mean, that's bound to happen, especially if you're playing with people that you haven't known your entire life or something. Like you might accident, or even if you have, like you could hit on something that they haven't even talked about that much or haven't brought up, or it didn't think to them, like, to bring this up in session 0 of like, hey, by the way, I know that magma damage or fire damage, fireballs, like these are common things in D&D. Please don't get too detailed because I was in a house fire and I was severely burned and I don't like thinking about it or remembering it, and it's much more visceral for me. Like that's just it can happen. Like, slip-ups can happen. So the big thing is when a player does come up to you, or if you are a player, too, it's very easy for that to happen. It's not just all on the DM. Other players can mess up. And the big thing, I see you, Kevin. Kevin, yes?
I have a story about that, too, actually.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
So something like this happening on the player side, I didn't talk to this person, but also I don't associate with this person. This was a one-time game. We were playing Monster of the Week, and this is my first impression of them. This is, how they are introducing themselves. It's like, all right, let's play Monster of the Week and see how we vibe, haha. And their character was, hey, before I get into this story, content warning for poltergeist grooming and child murder. If you aren't comfortable with that, skip ahead about 2 minutes.
Yeah, heads up. Speaking of content.
Yeah. Content warning there. This guy's backstory was messed up. Like we're playing Monster of the Week, and this guy's backstory was I was an orphan in middle school, and then at the orphanage, this ghost fell in love with me, and then killed all the other orphans, and then groomed me, and now I am an adult in a romantic relationship with this ghost.
Gothic.
And I want you to play the ghost.
Gothic. Oh my god.
Yeah.
How'd you feel about that?
Here's the deal. If this were a multi-session adventure, if he had talked to me about it beforehand, if he was like, hey, I have this idea for, like a dark but cool storyline, I might have actually been okay with it. Mm-hmm. But a one-shot where we're just kind of having fun and getting to know each other and you spring that on me, not comfortable.
That's a lot to spring onto somebody. Yeah. Like, hey, I want you to play the pedophile ghost that murdered all of my peers and trapped me into like a romantic relationship. I've never met you before, and this is for one session. Like, that's kind of a lot.
Yeah.
Not that that's not a sick backstory.
Like I said,
that,
with preparation and warning, that might have actually been very interesting. But that wasn't the kind of game I was wanting to play, especially for a one shot. I wasn't comfortable with that person because I didn't know them, and that's just kind of like a prime example on both sides, GM and player. If you're not thinking about these dark themes that you're messing with, you can mess up.
Yeah, and especially when you're playing games like Curse of Strahd, Take a Shot, or Monster of the Week that have these dark horror elements ingrained into the game, you fall into the trap of thinking everybody here is as cool with whatever as I am. And again, that's not entirely true. There's so many different subgenres of horror. I still have not seen the Saw movies. And I don't know if I ever will. And now I've heard that the first one is not quite as quote unquote bad as the others in terms, and not, I know that they're supposed to be like great films, at least the first one are supposed to be like really good. I acknowledge that. But it's the self mutilation just really like skeeves me out, and like that particular, and again, I know the first one isn't actually supposed to be as torture porn as the rest of them, but I mean, I like body horror, but that there's just something about that really like makes my skin crawl, and I don't know if I could actually sit through it, and I just haven't been able to bring myself to do it. But the like the American Werewolf in London werewolf transformation sequence, which is extreme body horror as well, totally cool with that. Love that shit. Let's go.
Fascinating.
And I guess maybe it's because one is like incredibly unrealistic and one is really realistic. Like I could theoretically be put in a bear trap jaw ripper thing. Like it could happen to me. I'm never going to turn into a werewolf, sadly, but I could get turned into a jaw ripper or put into a jaw ripper bear trap thing and have my mandible wrenched from my flesh, and that freaks me out.
Yeah, there's a diversity of human experience.
Yeah. And there's no particular reason. I've never been in a Saw situation, thank God. But I don't, it skeeves me out.
It's interesting that there is also that, like, all right, there's body horror in both of those instances, but one is like fantastical, and one, while it's, you know, an out of bounds head bear trap thing, is still more realistic in its presentation than the actual like werewolf transformation. Like that can be a factor in like what squicks you.
I would also say, like, the other thing is that I think this is probably fairly common, but if it is, say, in a book, it's different than if I'm watching it as a movie. I think I can take a lot. I think I would be probably more fine with reading Saw as a book than I would as a movie. And is it maybe because all of the sound effects are in my head? Perhaps. Like, for example, I recently read the Locked Tomb series, which is really great. Go read it if you haven't. Lots of content warnings in that sucker. It's great. It is necromancers. There's a ton of, like, gore and body horror all over the place. Super cool. Totally fine with it. But sometimes I'm like, if this was a movie, this would be so much more... Like, I would be so much more affected by it, I think, than if I was reading it. For some reason, if I'm reading it, it's a lot easier. Even though my imagination can make it so much worse than, like, a Hollywood special effects team could maybe do. Not that they're not incredibly talented. But yeah, I don't know. It's like there's differences there. And so when you're doing, like, a D&D game or a TTRPG, I mean, it's like an audiobook description, sort of. So... yeah, I mean, you might be surprised, like, oh, I didn't expect this to affect me and make me incredibly uncomfortable, because stuff like this in other mediums has never made me uncomfortable. Or, like, now it's happening to me, and that feels different than if it was happening to a fictional character on a screen that I have greater separation with. So, yeah, I mean, you might be unexpectedly affected by something, and... That's okay. I mean, just, you know, again, communicate.
And that's the main thesis of this, is like, hey, if you want to tackle dark themes in your games, communicate. Everything else we're talking about is just different tools for communication. And we're going to get into safety tools in just a minute. But, like, the main reason to communicate about these dark themes before you go into them is because once you agree on boundaries and tone and what kind of story that, you know, you're getting into and what game you're playing, you can go all out. Like, Kayla and I love playing with each other because we both love playing horror. And when we go into a horror adventure, we're both like, all right, time for the vampires with chainsaws. Let's go.
There was also... Okay, so real quick, before we get into safety tools, I do want to say, like, a little note on kind of PvP stuff. But real quick, before that...
The pre-note note.
A pre-note. Speaking on our own, this is, again, take a shot, curse a Strahd. In this game in particular, and in previous games, we've had, like, this little thing. Sometimes a character will get compelled by a monster or an enemy or whatever, and the player will sort of lose control of what they can do, and it becomes like attack your friends, or it becomes like you walk away, like you can't do anything. And I love that shit. I love when Kevin, like, it's just like, okay, and you have failed that, and now you may attack your party. Or you failed that, your character is out of commission. There's just something so juicy to me about suddenly, like, having to just watch helplessly while events unfold, and maybe it's because I don't have any responsibility anymore, and that's a relief to me. That it's like, well, if whatever happens, it's not my fault. I failed to save, and then everything went haywire. Like, I'm totally okay with, like, losing control of my player. It's happened a few times in different campaigns.
Your player character, you mean?
Yeah, player character. But it was kind of funny because recently in Curse of Strahd, one of our other PCs got compelled to walk away from a battle and was under compulsion, wasn't attacking anybody, but was basically, like, out of commission. And that player was just stressing. She was stressing in a way where I would be cackling and being like, good luck, motherfuckers. And she's stressing. And she was it, like, all turned out fine, and she was okay with it. But it was very funny because, like, afterwards she was like, yeah, I was sweating. Like, I was, like, not having a great time in the moment, but it was okay afterwards. Like, it all turned out okay, and so it was, like, retroactively, like, more fine with it, if that makes sense. But it was just, like, it was kind of funny because, again, it's like, this is something that has, like, never really happened to their character. Whereas it's, like, happened a lot to my character. And even with Curse of Strahd, I had, my entire backstory. I basically just texted Kevin and I was like, here's 3 sentences about the character. The rest, I don't know. She doesn't know. She's amnesiac. Fill it in. Have at it. And yeah, I mean, it's like you're going to have, like, different levels of control, I guess, of people wanting different levels of control over things that happen with their characters and sort of dealing with it. But yeah, I mean, that is why we play together so well, I think, is because I'm just like, have at it. Let's go, And so, like, Kevin can direct a lot of that at my player character. And that can, like, if other people at the table are okay with it happening, just not to their player character, like, that's another option. Where you can have, like, a couple of PCs that are like, I will fall on the sword for the drama.
And it's a consideration to put in, too. Like, we're, once again, Curse of Strahd, we're going into a vampire campaign, and I'm straight up like, hey, the main villain is a vampire. There's going to be themes of, like, hypnosis, manipulation, sexual coercion. And I'm like, I'm not going to go into explicit details, but, like, this is who you're up against. This is the classic vampire. And if we had a conversation where, like, another player came up to me, it's like, hey, I'm not comfortable with, like, any encounter where my character could get, like, mind controlled or have their will taken away from them. Then we would have to have a conversation about, like, well, there are multiple creatures in this game, not only vampires, but also, like, hags and, dark wizards and all that who have that ability. So this, it would either have been like, I have to make an effort to point those abilities at other people, or I'm like, maybe this isn't the game for you.
Yeah.
And that is also a potential result of these conversations,
Yeah. And it wasn't like that situation that I was talking about specifically did not get quite so as extreme as that or anything, just to, like, clarify.
Yeah.
But it was a good note of, like, some characters or some players are going to be more okay with danger and risk and whatnot on their players than others. And it's like, I mean, we're all signing up for our characters to potentially die, but some people are going to have different in the moment, like, reactions to it than others, like, some people are going to, like, be more gung-ho, let's go blaze of glory in the moment, where other players might be, like, crying at the table because this character that they love is dying.
Yeah.
And that's just something, like, you gotta handle kind of differently and stay light on your feet. The other thing I wanted to talk about, PvP, real quick before we get into safety tools.
Yes, the pre-note note, not the pre-note
Yeah.
note.
And I think PvP should be discussed in safety tools. And this was sort of, we talked about this a little bit earlier in the podcast of, like, player dynamics and party dynamics and things like that. It is very important, I think, especially if you are playing with a newer group or people that you haven't played with a lot, even if you've known them for a long time, to sort of preemptively discuss like arguments and infighting and things like that when you get into interparty conflict, because interparty conflict can be very juicy. But what you don't want is you don't want it to accidentally become like too personal kind of a thing. Because a lot of people might have a lot of themselves in their player character, you know, and so you just want to be careful about like insulting player characters and accidentally like also insulting the player. Because I love interparty conflict. I love doing it. I love engaging in it. I love starting it, etc. But it is supposed to be like for a purpose. It's supposed to be character building and relationship building. If you're like sniping, you know, just to like, oh, my character's a bitch, so she'd snipe at this player all of the time. Make sure that the other player is like okay with that, you know? You don't want to just do that without clarifying with them, hey, are you okay with having a little bit of an antagonistic dynamic here? Like, can we talk about what may or may not be okay? Like, let me know if I cross a line, etc. Again, like open lines of communication. But yeah, the DM's not the only one you need to be communicative with about this. You need to also be communicative with your fellow players.
Yeah. And on the flip side of that, you know, let's say you want to play a argumentative character, or like, let's say in D&D you want to play a rogue who like pickpockets people and sometimes, you know, takes loot for themselves, or sometimes even pickpockets their own party members. If you are going to play a character like that, be prepared for the other characters to kill you. I have played games early in my career where someone was like, oh, you know, this is just what my character would do. I'm just pickpocketing the other party members. And then the other party members came together and then killed their character and they got mad. And I'm just sitting behind the GM screen like, what did you expect, bro?
What, like, you can't just do stuff with impunity to your party members and expect them to take it. Like, they're gonna get pissed at you. Why would you be in a party with a thief that steals from you all of the time? Like, you wouldn't, you know? Unless, again, that's something that everybody talked about at session 0 of, like, I'm playing a kleptomaniac rogue who's going to probably pickpocket the rest of the party. Would everybody be okay with this being, like, a character arc that they go through, you know?
So let's go into safety tools now. These safety tools are basically like specific forms of communication and techniques that have been developed in the tabletop RPG community in order to make communication easier, especially in situations, you know, like new players, or you're doing a convention game or a one-shot. But these are also still useful for established groups as well, especially if you're going into a new storyline. So a lot of these TTRPG safety tools have been collected in the TTRPG Safety Toolkit. And let me just get that attribution into the podcast real quick. Ahem. The TTRPG Safety Toolkit is a resource co-curated by Kienna Shaw and Lauren Bryant-Monk. The TTRPG Safety Toolkit is a compilation of safety tools that have been designed by members of the tabletop role-playing games community for use by players and GMs at the table. You can find it at ttrpgsafetytoolkit.com. So let's go into some of these safety tools real quick. The first one that I really want to get into is one that I've heard been used at a lot of tables, lines and veils. This system was created by Ron Edwards, creator of the Sorcerer RPG, when they came out with the expansion Sex and Sorcery. The lines and veils safety tool was included in the Sex and Sorcery expansion because it's like, hey, if you want to put sex into your sorcery, here's how to go about it in a safe way.
I like that we've talked a lot about violence leading up to this and didn't mention what happens when you roll to seduce.
Yeah. God.
Fade to black.
Fade to black. Well, that's the next safety tool, actually, I'm about to get into. So let me get into lines and veils, and then we'll do fade to black. So lines to veils. Lines are hard boundaries, and veils are soft boundaries. And the purpose of the lines and veils system is to basically just talk to your players, or I've been in some games where they created like a Google sheet or an Excel sheet or something like that people could add to. And it's basically just like, you know, here are my lines. I don't want to interact at all with like child abuse or something like that. And then here are my veils. And it's like, hey, if we get into body horror, maybe we can move the scene along, or maybe we don't describe the werewolf transformation in incredibly gory detail, like that kind of thing.
I was about to, for the bit, launch into an incredibly detailed werewolf transformation, but then I was like, I feel like then we'd have to do another content warning. and another skip ahead. So I was like, let's not.
Content warning, Kayla making squishy noises for the next 10 seconds.
That's not my best work. It's okay. It's still early in the morning.
I'll add some like royalty-free sound effects and then just say it was you.
Yeah. Call me for your voice actor needs, apparently.
The beauty of Lines and Veils is that they can be changed and added to throughout the campaign. And even like mid-session, like, you know, if you start getting into something and then one person at the table starts like getting uncomfortable, they can very easily just be like, hey, maybe we could put a veil over this. Mm-hmm. You know, and then it's like, oh, okay, that's my cue to like, you know, kind of move on with the description or move on with the scene or, you know, what have you. But it's a really interesting safety tool because it like very clearly, like if you have those specific things that you are just not into or you're willing to work around, like you could just be as incredibly clear about it as possible.
There's also something that you can do. I mean, this is just something that happens, not necessarily because you're going over something that makes anybody uncomfortable, but like we have a table where it's like people will be like, I have to pee. Like we're not at a break, but I have to pee. Keep going. Like even in the middle of combat, it'll be just like when my turn is up, launch fireball. I have to go pee. But like that's also kind of an option. Like if you, not that you like shouldn't communicate or that your request for certain content to not be included shouldn't be respected, but also like you can, like if some description is getting like explicit, you can just like keep going. I'm just going to go to the bathroom. Like, and then take your chance to go pee while the DM continues the scene with the rest of the players. That is an option. I'm not saying like you should do that so that everybody else gets the fun, gory, squishy thing and you like, you know, go like walk out the theater or whatever for that scene. I'm not saying like you have to do that. I'm just saying that is also like an option potentially of just like excusing yourself from the table to like go get a snack or go get a drink while that scene continues and then come back. Like you could do that too. Like it's another option.
Another option is fade to black, which, you know, we mentioned earlier. And fade to black is specifically like, all right, you know, here's this scene coming up and we're about to get into the details. And then instead we're just, you know, like a movie, it's just going to be like, okay, we're going to fade to black. You know what happens next.
Yeah.
And this can be for stuff like, hey, my character and this NPC are about to do the do. So as we like lay in bed, fade to black. Or it could be like this character is tied up in a chair and a giant monster with a bloody machete is slowly coming up to them. He raises the machete. Fade to black. Squishing noise. Ah!
Roll a constitution check. Either way.
Yeah.
And you'll know, and everybody will know, okay, how that went.
But yeah, but it's a tool that's in visual media that you can import into your games. It's a very easy way to be like, all right, here's this thing that happened. We're not going to go into the details, but you know what's behind that black screen.
Yeah. Maybe you guys like to get into the nitty-gritty of when characters have sex at the table surrounded by your close friends. Maybe you do. We fade to black at our table. We don't need to go into the specifics of what's going on and who does what.
Unlike that one Community episode where they played Dungeons & Dragons, they just have like
oh my god, that was the funniest gag though. That was so good.
God.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to do that at your table, like, have at it.
Some people are like that.
Yeah, that's fine.
So, another safety tool that can be used is the X card. This technique was created by John Stavropoulos, and it's essentially just an index card with a big black X written in the center of it. And if you're playing a physical game, you put that card in the center of the table. Or if you're playing an online game, you can just type X in the chat. Either way, what this X card means is it's an unspoken sign to move along. And it's, you know, it's lines and veils without the prep, pretty much. It's like, all right, I'm about to get into this scene where like this messed up thing is about to happen. And this player at the table is like, I'm not comfortable with this. And I don't want to like voice that discomfort. So the easiest way for me is to like reach my hand in and just like tap on the card on the table and just be like, all right, we're moving on. And you know, that's the beauty of it, is like, you don't have to like voice like, hey, I'm not comfortable with this because yada, 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 or even like put it into words at all. You can just, especially if you're like getting really messed up about it, you can just be like a very simple gesture that signals to everyone without explanation, like, all right, let's move on. And then, you know, if you want to get into the explanation after the game, that's perfectly fine. But the point of the tool is that, like, when things are about to happen and you're surprised by it and you can't find the words for it. Just very simple gesture, move on.
Yeah, and that's chill. And if you're at a table where you start, like, people start giving you shit or whatever for not wanting to engage in certain content in the for funsy make-believe game, fuck them. Like, we all have different lived experiences, and we are all different people. We are legion, contradictory creatures, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So even if it's like, well, they used to be okay with stuff like this and now they're not anymore, or like even last session, like you're so fine with body horror, why is the bear trap getting you now, etc.? Like, it's like, because it's different, it's weird, like, I don't like it, it squicks me out and I'd like to move on.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so if you find yourself at a table where, like, people are being hostile to you for you communicating what does and doesn't make you uncomfortable, at that point, you might want to consider, unfortunately, not being a part of that table anymore, because, again, at the end of the day, this is supposed to be fun. But also, on the flip side, if you are at a table and you want to engage in darker themes and other people at that table don't, and you're getting frustrated because, like, that's what you want, you have to pull back to, like, respect other people's boundaries. It's okay to be frustrated. Don't take it out on them. It might be okay for you to find, like, a second table. Like,
yeah,
you know, that's okay. Like, it's like if you're playing Animal Crossing and you're upset that you're not getting the psychological horror out of Animal Crossing, go play a different game that isn't Animal Crossing. Like I said, I like horror or whatever. I enjoy feeling, like, uncomfortable in stories. It is cathartic to me. I do think that I don't want a completely sanitized experience for every single piece of media I consume. I enjoy things that make me uncomfortable and make me confront things that I don't normally want to think about, etc. And I think that there is something to be embraced. I think it's a little bit healthy to be uncomfortable every now and then. I think it's how we grow as people, etc. But, you know, everybody has their different levels of how uncomfortable they want to get. And that's just something that we all need to respect in a collaborative game.
Oh, yeah, most definitely. I think that's all I have to say on this subject, actually. I think we got, like, pretty precise on this.
I think so.
So whether you want to play your Animal Crossing tabletop RPG or your RPG where everyone has chainsaw hands and suffers from parental abandonment, have fun.
Is this not the plot of Chainsaw Man?
Sorry, I have Chainsaw Man on the brain as well. A new chapter came out, and speaking of dark themes,
children love Chainsaw Man. Children love Chainsaw Man almost as much as they love Five Nights at Freddy's. Did you know this?
Incredible. At the time of this recording, chapter, I believe, 167 came out. The alleyway scene, for those who are actively reading Chainsaw Man, and I'm not going to go into more details, but talk about dark themes. I'd recommend Chainsaw Man. It's not a tabletop RPG, it's a manga, but it's really, really good.
I mean, I plugged Lock Tomb, you can plug Chainsaw Man.
Disclaimer, we are not sponsored by Lock Tomb or Chainsaw Man, but hey...
I have a lot of questions, though, Tamsin Muir, so if you're listening to this for some reason, please hit me up.
And speaking of hitting us up, audience, what are some safety tools used at your table? What are some interesting experiences that you've had at your table, especially when tackling dark themes? Hit us up, let us know. And also, if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe, give us a rating, leave a comment, and share with a friend. Follow us on social media. We got those links in the show notes. We also have a Ko-fi. You can support us there and get access to cool bonus content stuff like extra episodes and access to the private Discord. Check it out.
Writing for Roleplay is a production of Digital Kaiju Studios. It is hosted and produced by Kevin Carpenter and Kayla Knudsen. It is edited mostly by Kevin because Kayla volunteered to do other stuff. Kevin, what am I supposed to do this week? We post a new episode every Tuesday. See you next week.
Bye.